In this video session, we're going to continue our discussion of market failure and look at now what causes market failure. There are several factors that could cause market failure. 1. Externalities. 2. Public goods. 3. Asymmetric information. 4. Merit goods. 5. Demerit goods. And we're going to discuss these throughout this particular video. What in fact are externalities? The fact is, in life there are commodities that do not only affect the person who's directly purchasing or directly producing the commodity, but there are third-party individuals, someone who was not directly involved, who would incur either a cost or a benefit. So externalities could be both positive and negative. So therefore positive externalities are also known as external benefits, and you have negative externalities which are known as external costs. So positive externalities are the spillover benefits that a third party enjoys that was not directly involved in the production or consumption process, whereas negative externalities are the spillover costs that a third party incurs that was not directly involved in the production or consumption process. An example of some positive externalities where a person who was not directly involved in the production or consumption but they still get the benefit could be, for instance, when a person who has a crying baby decides to purchase a comforter. That person bears the cost of purchasing the comforter, and therefore the baby, when using the comforter, will be quiet. But you may not be the person who purchased the comforter may not be the only person who benefits from the peace of mind when the baby uses the comforter. If you have a next door neighbor that is accustomed to hearing the baby cry in the wee hours of the morning, when this baby is now quiet due to the comforter purchased by the individual, your neighbor also benefits from the baby not crying, but they did not pay for the comforter. So that is one example of a positive externality. Another example would be if a consumer decides to purchase an electric car versus a car that utilizes gas. When this person bears the cost of the electric car, they incur a benefit of not polluting the air. So air pollution is reduced each time a new person purchases an electric car. Now, there are other individuals who live in direct surrounding of the persons utilizing the electric car. Some of them would walk, some of them would be riding, some of them would also be even utilizing gas-propelled or gas-driven cars. However, all of these individuals will benefit from cleaner air when an additional or a new person purchases an electric car, but they did not have to bear the cost. So, a person who is walking down the road or lives in a community where everyone drives an electric car, but they themselves do not own an electric car, well, they would have incurred a positive benefit, but for which they did not bear any cost at all. So those are some examples of positive externalities. Negative externalities, again, are the costs that a third person would have to bear, even though that they were not involved directly in the production or consumption process. For instance, if a firm produces a product and they dump that waste in a river, it contaminates the river, and anyone who utilizes the river for leisure or even for food via fishing, they would be negatively affected, but they don't own the firm. So therefore, individuals of a community that utilize a river for leisure or for food, when it becomes polluted due to a firm who dumps waste there, the society therefore bears that cost which the firm does not have to bear. And therefore, that's an external cost because the society is not involved in producing the commodity. It's the firm. So that there is an example of an external cost. Another example of an external cost is when, for instance, someone who smokes, and when they breathe out, they contribute to secondhand smoke. Now, an individual who does not smoke but is around an individual who smokes could possibly develop some form of respiratory disease. However, they themselves did not consume the cigarette, but it was another. So, person A who purchases the cigarette may not get sick at all, but person B who takes in the secondhand smoke may get sick, but they themselves did not consume the cigarette, but they had to bear the cost of the secondhand smoke. In terms of the costs that they would have to bear would be visiting the doctor, purchasing pharmaceuticals to aid them to breathe better, and other factors to help them have a better quality of life. So we see here that these are some examples of what negative externalities would look like. Now let's see if we could graph these things. So we said an external cost would be a cost that has to be borne by a third-party individual. Now let's look at it here. In this particular example, what we're seeing is that a firm dumps waste from production in a river, right? So the waste that is derived from production, the firm dumps in a river. Of course, this will lead to the pollution of the water table, affecting agriculture in the vicinity of the firm. So in this particular example, we're talking about a firm that produces, let's say in this case, fertilizer, and the waste from the fertilizer is dumped into the river. This, in fact, would pollute the water table, and therefore nearby farmers would be affected. It could result in a reduction in the yield of the farmers. The less output that the farmers can get from their products means less sales means less revenue means potentially less profit for the farmers. However, the farmers were not the ones who produced the fertilizer, it's actually the firm. However, the farmers are affected. It therefore means that when a firm produces, there is a private cost and then there is a social cost. The social cost is the cost that takes into account the entire society. That is, your marginal private costs plus external costs will result in marginal social costs. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Your marginal private costs plus your external costs will equal your marginal social costs. Okay? And therefore, if no externalities exist, meaning externalities are zero, it means that your marginal private costs will equal your social costs. This diagram here represents the demand and supply curve for fertilizer of the firm. We see here that the firm charges a price of $15 for the fertilizer. That's where we see the equilibrium position between the demand curve and the supply curve for fertilizer. So $15 is the price that will be paid for each unit or pound of fertilizer. And the equilibrium quantity lies between 24 and 28, approximately it could be 26. What we are saying is that because the firm does not bear the cost of repaying farmers for the loss of sale, they will be producing a level of output greater than if they were made to bear the cost. Let me rephrase. We realize due to the dumping of the fertilizer in the river, farmers are affected by the pollution. If the firm was made to bear that cost, meaning pay farmers for the loss of revenue, then the firm may choose to produce less fertilizer because it is not as profitable to produce too much because of the cost the firm would have to bear in paying the farmers for their loss in revenue. Okay? So it means that if the firm were to bear that cost, it will result in the supply curve being higher, which means a higher price would be charged for the fertilizer, which will result in a lower equilibrium quantity. So what we're saying is that when external costs exist, it means that too many units of a particular product are being produced. There's a high equilibrium quantity. However, if the firm was made to bear the total cost of production, which will not just be the private cost, but also whatever external costs may exist, then it will result in a higher price being paid or being charged for the fertilizer, which will mean a lower equilibrium supply. So $15 is the private cost of the product in this particular scenario. If the firm were to bear the total cost, the total cost, which would be private cost plus external cost, the price that they would charge would be $30. So ultimately, we could see via this diagram that because the firm does not take into account the entire cost, which will be the social cost, but that they only take into account their private costs, which will be this supply curve here, it results in a higher level of output, equilibrium output, and a lower price being charged. So ultimately, we can see here that when we're beginning to look for a solution to external costs, our goal would be to cause the firm to absorb all the costs that are involved in production, not just the private costs, but also the external costs. And if that is possible, it will result in higher prices being charged for the firm's product and a lower equilibrium quantity. Moving on, looking at the external costs that can arise when someone consumes. So the previous diagram looked at external costs from the production side. Now we're looking at external costs or negative externalities that can arise from consumption. Picture someone who smokes a cigarette, and as a result of the secondary smoke, we see lung cancer and other respiratory diseases can arise. What we're saying here is that cigarettes as a commodity, cigarettes as a product, are being produced in too great a quantity. Firms should reduce the supply of cigarettes because the impact on society is too great. So, for every person who develops some respiratory disease, the firm was made to bear that hospital visit cost or to bear the cost of purchasing pharmaceuticals. It means that the firm would have to incorporate that cost in their production, and therefore it will result in a higher price being paid for the product and a lower equilibrium quantity. So, because the firm only takes into account their private costs, which is this supply curve, their marginal private cost, it will result in a higher level of equilibrium quantity being produced and a lower price. However, if we can force or encourage the firm to pay all persons' hospital bills and pharmaceutical bills, which means that they would internalize the external costs, it will result in a lower equilibrium quantity existing in society and therefore a higher price. So again, in this diagram, the external cost will be this vertical distance between the two supply curves. $15 would be the actual price that firms charge because firms only care about their marginal private cost. They do not take into account the cost on society. However, if we are able to get them to care about the external costs, which will be the costs on society, it would result in them producing on supply curve S prime and therefore at a higher equilibrium price, $21, on a lower equilibrium quantity, which will be 8 packets of cigarette. We shall continue our discussion of the other factors that cause market failure in subsequent videos. Thank you.